Welcome back, everybody. My name is Jeremy, and you are tuning in for part 3 of our 4-part series on basically everything you need to know in order to kickstart your illustration career in 2026. If you've missed parts 1 and 2, they are available for replay, so you can always watch those. But just to give you guys a little bit of a recap of what we've covered so far, we've spoken about which apps you can use. So we've talked a little bit about Photoshop, Illustrator, and Fresco, and covering some of the pros and cons of that, what you can do, what they're best used for, what are some of the downsides to them. So we've covered all of that in the first part. And today we're going to focus a little bit more on Photoshop and talk about something super exciting in terms of working with clients making changes, and that is known as a non-destructive workflow. But before we get into it, I just wanted to kind of talk to you guys a little bit about what the whole kind of guide of this is. So what we've got on screen right now is a little kind of a self-directed project. I'm a big fan of video games. I like obviously illustrating and trying to kind of basically build a portfolio piece. So this is a piece that I've just created from scratch. I've obviously invented this client and this brief, given myself a little bit of a write through. That is part 1 of our video, part 2 of our video, and just going through all of those motions in terms of like basically getting a portfolio piece. That's the idea of this 4-part series. So again, if you've missed 1 and 2, you can always catch them on the replay. Now, let's get straight into non-destructive workflows and a few kind of tips and tricks in Photoshop. Let's go. Okay, so we're in Photoshop. I've just opened up a simple blank canvas, haven't done anything to this yet. We've got our layers panel open, that's the kind of the barest minimum, and we've got our brushes up here. You can see that I'm using a drawing tablet as well. You can see the glow up on my face right now, and I'm going to be using that to basically kind of draw everything that I'm going to be drawing digitally. Just a note on that, we've spoken about this in the first video, but if you are serious about becoming a digital artist, regardless of whatever program you're going to be using, you are probably going to need something that's going to mean you're not going to have to use a mouse, and instead you can use a pen, right? So you don't really want to be drawing with a mouse unless potentially you're doing pixel art. That's probably okay, but you'll still probably want something to be able to sketch with. So I'm using one of those. Okay, so what is a non-destructive workflow? It sounds a little bit fancy. Basically what it is it's trying to utilize one of the main advantages of working digitally, which is you're able to make changes and edits on the fly without committing necessarily to anything. As opposed to an analog workflow, whereas if you kind of paint a canvas and you want to change the color, you're basically going to have to redo that whole work and paint over that and just kind of start afresh a little bit. So when we're working with clients, we obviously want to be able to hand in a digital file, but we want to be able to make changes using as little time as possible going over work we've already done. So it's basically kind of smoothing out your workflow and making sure that you don't have to rework file too much in order to then make those changes for a client. So let's take a look at what are some of the basic aspects of a non-destructive workflow. Check on my trusty glove here. Step number 1 of any non-destructive workflow is working with layers. Layers are an absolute lifesaver. They're a massive time saver as well. They'll allow you to make individual changes to certain elements in your file, in your image, regardless of what you've kind of put in underneath it. You can reorder things, you can move stuff around, resize it, rotate, you can do whatever kind you want to that, so long as it's on a layer. So step number 1 of any non-destructive workflow is, rather than going in kind of like super hard and just painting straight onto the background layer, in which case it's locked, you might as well have just kind of painted paint onto a canvas and gone back to an analog workflow. We want to make a new layer here, right? So we're going to leave that as layer 1 for now. But effectively, when I do this, I can rescale, I can rotate, I can duplicate, I can erase this one without erasing something else, and so on and so forth. Now, I've said kind of I can erase things. I probably shouldn't say that, because erasing is one of the kind of the counterproductive ways of working. It's a very destructive way of working, right? So we're focusing on non-destructive. We want to avoid basically deleting any pixels. So the first kind of point that you might say, if a client says like, oh, I really like this, but I want you to get rid of this line, right? Let's say that's the feedback from the client. So your first kind of idea might be, all right, I'll just erase that. Job done. But if you then kind of keep working for a bunch of hours on this, and then the client, a week later comes back to you and says, you know what, I changed my mind. I actually really love that line. I want it back. you're basically going to have to redraw it almost exactly the way it was, which can be really difficult. It can take up a lot of time potentially. Obviously, I've done something really simple here. It's just a line, but if you had something a lot more kind of detailed and intricate, that's going to take you a hell of a lot more time to do. Really not a very good way to work. So instead of deleting things, what Photoshop will allow you to do, and a bunch of other programs as well, you can do this in Illustrator, you can do this in Fresco, you can do this in pretty much any app that you're using, is to hide something rather than deleting it, or in Photoshop's kind of terms, mask it. Right? So I'm going to go down to my layer panel here, and basically what you're looking for is this kind of like rectangle with a circle inside, and it is called layer mask. I'm going to add a mask to that specific layer that's only going to affect that layer. So let's click on that, and nothing's happened to my image, but in my layer panel, you can see it's added this kind of rectangle in here. If you pay attention as well, let me undo that. Have a look down here at my color palette, which is this kind of like pink and white. We've got a foreground color of this kind of like pink, peach color, and our background color, which is white. As soon as I click on my make a layer mask button, watch those colors, they'll swap to black and white. Okay, so there we go, we got black and white. Now, why it's doing that is pretty straightforward. It takes some getting used to, but once you understand how this works, you're set. Basically, if I paint with black, I'm going to be hiding sections of that line, right? So I can basically just go in and say, all right, I'm going to hide rather than erase that line, okay? And if you can see that, it's pretty kind of small on my screen, but you can probably see it there. It's made this little kind of mark. So like, let's zoom all the way out. I'm going to take a bigger brush and I'm going to paint like let's say like an X through this, right? You can see that is showing up on there as that kind of thing. So on my mask, anything I paint black onto will hide whatever is on that layer. But I can bring this back. So I'm going to swap my foreground and background color. I'm going to swap it from black to white. And now I'm going to be painting with white. And white is going to reveal that layer again. Right? So all that artwork is back into view, no problems at all. I can kind of do what I want. So effectively, now I can come in and say, all right, well, I'm going to hide that because that's what the client has asked for. But if they come back with some feedback and say, you know what, I want it back, then it's a simple matter of just me undoing that layer mask and kind of painting back over it. Massive time saver. It's exactly the artwork that was there before. I don't have to redraw anything. I can just work on that layer mask. So that's the kind of the main gist of a layer mask. But let's see that in action on something a little bit more complicated. I've got this illustration. There's a lot going on in here. Little kind of red panda samurai character. He's looking a little bit plain in his garments, right? So like samurai gear is always super detailed. There's a lot going on. So I've created this pattern in Illustrator, and I want to put it onto his jacket, but only his jacket. So let's drag this into our canvas here and drop it onto that layer. I'm going to place it on top of that. So again, this is where my kind of non-destructive workflow is going to come in super handy. We make a duplicate of that because I'm going to break it on purpose to kind of show you a good use of a layer mask or a typical use of a layer mask in my workflow, working with patterns and everything else. Well, I'm going to erase everything on here and go. And that's looking pretty good. Yeah. But like, let's say I mess up. I cut into that kind of jacket there and I don't really see it, or I decide that I want it to be in other places as well. And let's say I close this file, save it, bring it back. If I want to bring this pattern back in, I'm basically going to have to like redraw this pattern in there. That's going to take forever. That is not a good way to work in those kind of aspects. So instead of erasing, I'm going to put a layer mask on that, and I'm going to invert it. So I'm going to swap it from white, which at the moment is revealing everything. I'm going to flip it. I'm going to make it hide everything just so that I can kind of see what I'm painting a little bit more clearly. I'm going to swap to a white color, and then I'm literally just going to paint in the areas where that kind of blazer red jacket is. And I can be a little bit kind of rough on that, not too careful where I'm going, because again, if I screw up and do this, I can just swap again. So I'm pressing X, by the way, to swap, and then I can start kind of drawing all that in again. And I'm not losing any of that information. I'm just hiding it. So this is an ideal scenario for working with layer masks in that sense, right? So there you have it. I've got my pattern gen just on his jacket. I haven't lost anything. I haven't deleted everything. It's all there just waiting for me to work. So layer masks are really kind of like one of the powerhouses of a non-destructive workflow. The next thing that we're going to take a look at in terms of a non-destructive workflow tool is something called adjustment layers. Adjustment layers are something that are really powerful to make edits on the fly. And there's a huge range of different options in there. And again, because we're working digital and because we're working in a smart workflow, we don't necessarily have to commit to any of those, and we can fully control how how those kind of edits affect the image that are underneath them. So let's take a look. All right, so now we've got another sort of pretty complicated image. There's a lot of colors going on, a lot of potential edits to be made to this. If the client decides to change their mind, there's a lot of kind of things to be done. By the way, non-destructive workflows are great for making kind of small edits and that sort of stuff. If a client decides, oh, can you change her, this character's hair to be something else, then obviously you're going to have to redraw those things. There's a limit to what you can or can't do with adjustment layers. But there's a lot that you can do as well. And that's why I'm sort of really encouraging you guys to get used to using these. So let's take a look at this. And one of the things that we're going to do with this is potentially maybe make edits to some of the colors in there. If we've done our layers correctly, that should be pretty easy. And then maybe add some shading onto this. So, if you were doing this in an analog way, putting shading onto this would be quite complicated. There's a lot of different colors. We're going to have to make a shading color for the white, the pink, for this kind of teal, dark teal color. There's a lot of different things happening in here that we're going to have to work with and make a shade for. If we're working in an analog sense, if we're working in a digital way, it'd be pretty easy using adjustment layers. And here's how. So we spoke about layers a little bit. I've got all of my colors for this character in this kind of shorthand. I call it cold because I can't be bothered to type out colors every time I name my layers. Naming layers is pretty important. It's not necessarily a non-destructive workflow, but it's just a really smart workflow to get used to working with, especially if you're going to start to have heaps and heaps of layers. As you can see here, I've got quite a few layers in there. I need to be able to kind of see, what's what in here. So all the pinks, for instance, in her uniform, I've put on its own layer. So let me show you how to do this in a destructive way, and then you can kind of see what the benefits are of doing this non-destructively. So let's go ahead and change the color of this pink, for instance. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my image adjustments, and here I've got a bunch of different options that I can go through. Right? What I'm looking for in order to change color is hue saturation. I'm going to click on that. And that's going to allow me to change that to, let's say, I don't know, let's go with a orange or something like that. Make it a little bit more retro than the kind of the bright pink that we had there. So that's all good. I've changed that. All good to go. Save it, close it, keep working on a bunch of different things. Client changes their mind, says, you know what, actually, I don't want it to be that. Can you come back and change it? So this is probably one of those things that's like, well, you could just kind of change it back to what it was and you can make it pink again. But the issue with that is, what if the client was trying to get the exact same pink that it used to be? That might be a little bit of an issue, right? I've brought it back to pink pretty easily. That hasn't been a lot of time and effort for me. But if I needed it to be the exact same tone of pink for, branding purposes, maybe there's a Pantone swatch, maybe there's, brand colors, whatever that might be, that's going to be a lot harder to replicate using that panel if I haven't noted that color down. So instead of doing that, what I can do is, while I've selected that pink layer, I'm going to go to this little half-cut circle there, and you can see what it kind of highlights there is to create a new adjustment layer. And so I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to go into that same menu. So you can see here, this menu is pretty much the same one that I have up here. So I can now put an editable adjustment layer on a layer rather than just do it straight onto it and lock it into that layer. So I'm going to do that. and I'm going to go back to my hue and saturation, and it's going to bring out this kind of menu again. And here I can change that to this, right? So I can change it to orange, but you will notice that as I'm doing that, it's also changing the other colors. So what that adjustment layer is doing is it's affecting every layer underneath the adjustment layer. So I've got my hue saturation adjustment layer right there. Every other layer underneath it is being affected by that. So in order to have it just do the layer immediately underneath it, we're going to click on this little button right here. And that means that now that is only impacting that specific layer underneath. So now I can change these colors to my heart's content and, go for live. But if the client then decides to change their mind and say, like, bring it back to the brand thing that we had, I can just hide that, or I can just, delete that if I'm worried about kind of bar size or anything like that. I could delete it, probably a bit destructive to do that. So I can just hide it, and I've got that color back again. So again, I haven't locked any changes in. I haven't destroyed any pixels. I haven't forever changed them. Everything is, non-committal. Everything is you can come back to the original state as much as possible. So that's the workflow that we're aiming for. So let's take a look at that in terms of adding shading to this. And one of the ways that I like to do this in my artwork is to put an adjustment layer, but put it on an entire group. So you can also put an adjustment layer on a group of layers rather than just on each individual layer. So you do the exact same thing, select that group of all of my colors here, click on my adjustment layer and go to hue saturation. And then same thing, I want to make sure that I've got that kind of clicked on there. You can see it. When it's not, you'll have this little kind of thing. And when it's off, you will just see everything. And if I change the layers here, you'll see it's changing the big yellow circle in the background. If I click on that, it only changes those colors. So I can change that, but if I bring that color back down to like a 0 and just drop the lightness of that, I will then have a shadow pasted onto this that's going to allow me to create some shading to this. You'll notice as well, one of the things that has happened here is I've got my adjustment layer right there, but I've also got a layer mask on that. And that's a very handy thing to have on an adjustment layer. It means that I can use that adjustment layer to only impact certain areas of whatever I place that adjustment layer onto. And that's how I create my shading, right? So I've got a layer mask actually that I've already done previously on a separate layer. This is just a lowered opacity black that I put a layer mask onto. So I'm going to bring that back in and I'm going to drag my layer mask onto the layer mask, and it's going to ask me if I want to replace it. I'm going to hit yes, please. And it's going to put that adjustment layer only on certain areas where I've dictated my light has happened, right? The cool thing about this is I can double click back on this and, control how dark or light that is. If I wanted a little bit more kind of color in my shadows, like let's say I didn't want them to just be black, that's rarely a good way to go, by the way, just kind of flat black for colors. And when you're talking about shading, we can kind of mess around with different tones, make the shadows, warmer or cooler, or just kind of, get something that's going to be a little bit more interesting in terms of shading in there. And that is always editable. So long as I come back and I double click on that, I'll bring up that menu and I'll be able to make those edits on the fly as well. So you can see here, I've also added in this, a separate kind of adjustment layer. So this one is a gradient map. And that's going to be really cool to give my image maybe a little bit more of a retro vibe to it. I've got a bunch of different gradient maps that I put in here that I can use to kind of make edits on the fly. I use that a lot whenever I'm kind of messing around with colors. If I'm trying to get something going that I maybe hadn't thought of, I'll flip through some of these and go like, hey, that's kind of cool. Maybe I can make my artwork like that. And these are all adjustment layers that will work in that sense. And again, because I am working to a layer mask, I can come in and hide some of this and kind of showcase the image underneath it without worrying too much about how that's going to impact the rest of the artwork. So again, very cool, non-destructive way of working. Really nice to be able to make those edits on the fly and just kind of work to an individual basis in that way. And then the last really powerful tool that we've got for our non-destructive workflow is something called Smart Objects. Smart objects are a real boon when you're working with mockups, when you're working with elements that you're bringing in from other images into your artwork and making changes to those. Things like stickers or, mocking up something on a t-shirt and you want to place it in, make some edits, but then you might want to come back in a little bit later. You can do that with smart objects. So here's how they work. So I've got this illustration I did last year in Photoshop. As you can see, there's a ton of elements in here. I've got a lot of layers going on. And ideally I've brought in a bunch of elements that I might have designed flat somewhere in another image, and brought them into here and edited them to have this 30-degree angle perspective in there. So let's show you guys how that works with a smart object versus just a regular layer. So I'm going to bring in this design. As you can see, I've got a multi-layer design. Again, we've spoken about layers. If I wanted to, I could edit the colors in this thing pretty easily. All that works pretty well. So I'm going to grab all of that and I'm going to group it into a layer. So I can click down here, group it into a layer, or Command G on my keyboard, and I can take that and paste it into my image. So I've got my group in there like so. Whoopsie daisy. There we go. And I'm going to do the same thing again, and I'm going to bring it in as a smart object. So with this group done, I'm going to right click on that group and I'm going to say convert to smart objects. Now it's going to get rid of the group and show me just that layer as it is, which actually makes it a lot easier for me to bring it in. So there we go. We've got the same design twice and we can start working on this, but watch the difference. So one of the two main things that I can do with smart objects is to scale images without losing any resolution loss, or at least scale them down and then back up again without having that resolution loss. Right? So let me show you how that works in Photoshop. I've got both of these selected. I'm going to drop the resolution down, way down, and I'm going to hit enter. Right? At this point, because I'm working in Photoshop and I'm working with a raster file rather than vectors, the one on the left here, which is not a smart object, that is now its native scale. So if I grab both of those again and scale them back up, watch what happens. The regular layer has lost a ton of resolution. It's really blurry. It's horrible. It's not a nice crisp edge like the other one. So what's happened there basically is I've told Photoshop, make this bitmap image just raster image just this size, and then I'm going to scale it back up again. And obviously what happens when you scale up an image that is a bitmap or a raster image, it's going to lose a lot of resolution. Whereas the smart object layer, the one on the right, hasn't done that. So it's like a halfway point in between raster and bitmap, if you will. So that's really handy if you know you're going to be rescaling things, if you know you're resizing those things up. Bring it in as a smart object makes it a lot easier to do so. The second of the two main things that you can do with smart objects is to make edits to an illustration or an image after you've brought it into another image like a mockup, in this case, t-shirt mockup, and actually made edits to the perspective, to the lighting, you've maybe distorted it and so on and so forth, but you still want to be able to go back and make some edits. Smart objects have got you covered. So I've got this t-shirt mockup, it's just a flat JPEG, and I've got this illustration that I've done super quickly as well. And I'm going to bring this in to my image. So I've already made it into a smart object, right? So this was a group of smart objects I had as a layer like this. So I grouped them all together, and then I did the same thing, right click, convert to smart object. And now I can bring this in to my t-shirt illustration. So I can resize this again, as we saw, and I won't have to worry about it losing any resolution. But what's really cool with this is I can then grab this and start making some edits to this. And I'm going to do this really roughly, all right? I'm not going to spend a lot of time making this mock-up perfect on this t-shirt. I'm just going to get it so that it looks like it's on the back of this t-shirt. And then we should be all good for that, just to illustrate this point. All right? So I've made some warps and stuff that are pretty intensive to this image. But now, if I said, you know what, actually, I don't want it to say ba-bomb, or I want it to change the color of that type or whatever, what I can actually do is, rather than the old way with a regular layer, which is bring this illustration back into my t-shirt, after it's been changed, redo the whole kind of same thing, hope that it's the same kind of transformation and everything, which never will be. I can do something a lot faster than that, and I can double click on the smart object icon here that's popped up on this layer. And it's going to open up a temporary version of that file. And so now I can go into this and I'm going to say, oh, you know what, I want to change the color to this to like a light blue, and hit return. And now when I save that, it's not actually going anywhere on my hard drive. It's not saving a copy of it. It's just saving into kind of like a temporary cache file. And now when I go back onto my tees, the color of that type has been updated with all the edits already there. So I can actually do a ton of stuff to this without having to worry about, you know, what's going on and how am I kind of working it up. Everything is going to update in real time with that smart objects. It's a really awesome tool for mocking your work up onto, you know, any kind of packaging, any textiles, streetwear, anything like that that you're showing to a client. You really want to bring that work to life and showcase how it's actually going to look once the product is finished. Smart objects have got you covered, and they really are super powerful for those two things. So number one, rescaling at least up to its regular size. If you scale that object past its native size, right? So from the image that you got it from, you bring it into that image. If you try and make it bigger than that native image, you will start to lose some resolution because you are still working in rasters, but you won't get a broken file from scaling it back up, down, and then back up again in that way. And then the second thing is making edits, bringing those images back and forth into two different images and having those update on the fly. That's everything for our non-destructive workflow tutorial in Adobe Photoshop. Just to recap, we covered looking at layer masks and how to use them. We have adjustment layers and how to use those, and then smart objects and the power that they bring to mockups. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys got something out of it. We've got our fourth and final part to this 4-part series coming up. So make